Hello and welcome to WOLV-TV Spotlight. I'm Sean Henderson, and today I am joined by an incredible guest and one that wears many hats: 12-time Emmy Award-winning producer, Academy Award-eligible director, writer, reporter, and overall storyteller, Jon Fish. Jon graduated from the University of Michigan in 1995 and within a few years found himself at ESPN. Now, 28 years later, he has produced or directed long-form and short-form documentaries for the network, as well as segments for ESPN's very popular pregame show, College Game Day. Jon, thank you so much for sitting down with us today.
That's quite an intro. Wow. I am so honored and thrilled to be here. This is incredible. What you guys are doing is incredible. This is an unbelievable experience, so thank you for having me.
Yeah, I mean, you're doing more for us than we are for you by sitting down with us.
No way. The pleasure's all mine. This is an honor and a thrill.
So I wanted to start off today talking a little bit about your career path. You graduated from Michigan, as I said, in 1995, and what I found interesting, what stuck out to me, is that you were a history major when you graduated, which one doesn't really expect to be the typical major career path for somebody in sports media as you are. Can you tell me what, if anything, kind of changed at graduation and how you ended up where you are?
It's a long story, but I was a Roman and American history major because I grew up in a town called Lexington, like Lexington and Concord. And so for me, you took intro to history, and there was like the first 12 classes was like, and then the British came to Lexington. I was like, okay, yeah, I'm a Minuteman. Like literally, that's my high school nickname. So it was easy for me to take those classes, and I enjoyed them. The communication school, I just decided not to do it as a major. It was a smaller major at the time. I was really interested in history. I actually started out here at Michigan as an architect. I had a visual background. I had a whole portfolio, and I came into school. The way the Michigan architecture worked then was you took a year of LS&A, and then you did 4 years in the architecture school on North Campus, because the architecture classes are long studio windows, and it wasn't feasible to do that and balance like a normal class schedule, like North Campus to here, as we all know. So, but one of my friends at the time was like, well, if you really don't love architecture or you're torn, like I wouldn't necessarily say you should do that. And so I had been working. WOLV was just starting, if not didn't exist. It was in its. I looked at it when I talked to the founders of WOLV for my documentary, The Michigan, Scott Doyne. He was starting it in South Quad at the time. Now you guys have this whole beautiful, unbelievable facility, but at the time you didn't have that. So I worked at WCBN, and I was doing the news and calling some baseball games, and I was like, well, I really kind of like this. And at the same time, I'd actually tried to walk on the Michigan football team as a kicker. I didn't end up making it, but I built my schedule my senior year around trying to walk on the football team, because all I really ever wanted to do was run out of the tunnel and touch the banner. And I had been recruited to play like Division III soccer, but Michigan didn't have a men's soccer team at the time when I got here, and so I always had a big leg, so I could kick field goals, and it was just something I did for fun. Ultimately, that left me with a lot of free time. I went to work at the athletic department. I also threw homecoming for the university, and all these different things that I was doing between homecoming, which was great. I got to bring in a rock band, and I got to bring in a comedian, and we threw a parade. And that was like my anniversary coming back for this is incredible, because it was my senior year. Between all of that, and I just said, this is kind of something I want to do. At the end of the school year, there was a seminar for athletes only, but because I worked in the athletic department, I worked in marketing. I went to like the women's volleyball games and handed out programs, that type stuff. I did anything to kind of be around. And there was a seminar for student athletes that basically, if you're not going pro, but you still want to work in sports, here are some options. And I met a man from CNN, and he said, well, I can't give you an internship over the summer, but we can give you an internship in the fall at CNN Sports in Atlanta. And I started my career from there. And I called my parents and I said, I'm going to try to chase this. I mean, when you're coming out of school at my my time. For what I wanted to do, there were 3 paths. It's all changed because of the phone. But the 3 paths were you could chase Hollywood, which is always difficult.
Yeah.
Path number 2 is you could chase the internet, because the year I graduated was actually the same year that one of our most famous alumni, Larry Page, was graduating. So the internet, that gives you an idea. Larry Page is the guy who founded Google.
Yeah.
So it gives you an idea of how in its infancy, the internet was. Or the third and safest option was chasing a TV career.
Yeah.
So I went to CNN and started there, and I had wanted to do on-camera stuff. I didn't really have a lot of experience, but I started from there, and I just kept learning on the job and learning more and discovering what I really liked about TV.
Mm-hmm.
And so while I didn't have a grounding per se in day-to-day like doing this, I certainly did not do this. What I learned at the University of Michigan, both outside of the classroom and most importantly in the classroom as a history major, was you can't describe how important that is for what you're doing, because you're reading a ton of books.
Yeah.
And you're writing a ton of papers. And writing is storytelling, reading and understanding and reading comprehension, putting all that on paper and explaining your thoughts to your professor or an audience. It's all the same. The grounding that the university gave me academically and outside with the opportunities like WCBN and now WOLV, you can't crystallize that and how important that was for what I do now.
Yeah, and I think because you just said a little bit about being able to think and articulate your ideas to an audience, I think the history aspect is also, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, present in your work, with Going Big being set around, for example, the 1980 Summer Olympics is mentioned in there, and the return having to do very heavily with the Vietnam War.
Yep, that's 100% true. In fact, there was this unbelievable class. It was like a high level, like a 300 or a 200 level class. I think it was Vietnam 318, and it was taught by this unbelievable professor. He purposely put it at 8 a.m. on Friday mornings. So you really had to want to learn about it. But I took that class, and it was very hard. I did well, and I read a ton of books. But when I went to go do the return for Rocky Bleier, the grounding in my knowledge from what I learned, I directly used that knowledge that I learned in the history class here in that work. And it's hard because you can't understand the subject unless you really study the subject and you prepare and research. And fortunately, I had that grounding from my classes at the University of Michigan.
Yeah, and just to talk a little bit about being in Ann Arbor again, you've come back, before obviously Homecoming. You mentioned being a part of, you're here for Homecoming right now, and you've also done segments for College Game Day, as we've talked about, and that show has visited Ann Arbor 15 times, third most of any school. How does it feel to come back even today to your old campus?
Oh, every time I come back, and I come back a lot, I just don't really ever have the time. Like if I come back for College Game Day, I'd come back in, maybe I'd come in the night before, and then I would, recently when I was doing the Corso documentary, the Lee Corso documentary, my flight got diverted to Detroit, and then when I got to Detroit, it got canceled because there were thunderstorms going back east. And so they're like, well, we don't have any rooms here. And I just called my travel department and said, just put me in Ann Arbor. So I literally went from Miami to Detroit, drove to Ann Arbor like a month ago, stayed the night, got some food I liked. I think I went to Mr. Spots.
Yeah.
And then and then flew out the next morning and flew home. And it was just, Ann Arbor's home. It always will be. I've been very fortunate to come back here. I was here for the 2023 car wash. I was fortunate to tell Kwity Paye's story, who played for Michigan. He now plays for the Colts. Yes. I was fortunate to tell Eric All's story a couple years ago, the firefighter story, about how he was saved as a child. So there's been a lot of great stories that have come out of Michigan and Michigan football, and I've been fortunate to come back. And then obviously I was able to do one of my bigger documentaries on Mike Legg's The Michigan Goal, which was another story that's close to my heart as a hockey player myself. So
I was actually going to ask, that would have been my next question. How special was that story to you, especially to be able to explore it deeper than other, shorter Michigan pieces?
Well, so the great thing about that story was that goes into what I'm talking about, reporting and researching. Coming out of COVID, I was watching my son's hockey practices, and for a while during COVID, you weren't allowed in the rink because of COVID restrictions. Sent your son in, no matter how young they were, you put their skates on in the parking lot and you sent them in, and then you see me in an hour, make sure you bring all your gear back. So you're sending a 7, 8, 9-year-old into the rink. And so the year out of COVID, I came back and I was watching practice for the first time, and I saw all these little kids trying to do a Michigan, getting down like Mike Legg and trying to scoop the puck up. And I thought to myself, that's really weird. Why are they doing this? And so I pitched it to my boss, and he's like, is this really a thing? And I'm like, trust me, it's a thing. So I had to convince a couple people. And finally they said, yeah, you can do that on the side. And then all of a sudden, midway through me doing it on the side, like, yeah, I'll grab an interview here, I'll go to Vancouver, I'll interview Mike Legg. And that was a whole other thing because they hadn't been able to get Mike Legg before. And so I actually emailed them and I said, hey, Mike, Jon Fish, ESPN producer, go Blue. And they're like, you got Mike Legg to respond to you? And so Mike called me back right away and he said he would do it. So we started doing the documentary on the side, and then Connor Bedard pulls a Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
And my boss came back to me and he's like, so I guess it's a thing. I said, it's a thing. So that was cool. And that was reporting and seeing and doing, and me kind of looking for an answer. I wanted to know why my 8, 9-year-old son, 7-year-old kids were doing Michigan, and it turns out during COVID, the answer lies in COVID. During COVID, YouTube was what these kids spent all their time doing. Yeah. And if you're a hockey player, a young hockey player, and you're looking for something, you turn on YouTube. Oh my God, that's the coolest thing ever. Well, if you have no school to go to and you have all the time in the world and you can't get in the hockey rink, you sit in your basement and you try to figure out how to do it. And that turned out to be the answer. And then it became a thing that I was able to report out. And then when the pros started doing it, we were able to tell the story. Now the vision for it, Mike, I always had this vision of Mike on this frozen pond in the middle of nowhere performing the Michigan. And to ESPN's credit, if you have a vision and you can articulate it to them and explain, this is what I want to do within reason budgetarily. If I could dream it, I could and figure out a way to do it cost effectively and visually, we can make it happen. So we went and we were able to make it happen. And that's, you see those spectacular shots at the beginning with Mike, against the Canadian Rockies, which are just incredible. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, I remember watching that opening and thinking that's such a visually appealing thing to see with the mountains in the background, but also such a dynamic opening because you're on the ice with him, basically.
Yes, and you're alone, but you're not alone. Mm-hmm. And you're living this intimate moment of a player that loves a sport. And it's great because you can see where this came from. You can see his love of hockey. You can see his ability of taking and creating something that had never been done before. And that's, and then being able for us to tell the story of how he saw Bill Armstrong, who he gives full credit for, and Bill Armstrong had done it first. He learned it from Bill. His just happened to be on a more higher profile stage, and away we go, and now here we are. Bill created it, and Mike was able to do it on the stage, and now we have a hockey move called the Michigan, which is crazy, and a lot of people say it should be called the leg. So it is what it is.
And I think, because you mentioned YouTube kind of helped popularize this, I think social media and the internet are very interesting, not just with the Michigan, but also in the context of going big, because there's some comparison back, and this is pre-internet, with Sam Bowie basically his entire life. He got compared to Ralph Sampson in high school, then Michael Jordan. And I think comparison really is intensified nowadays, what with YouTube, social media. From your standpoint, having talked to Bowie, what do you think, how do you think that impacts an athlete both mentally and on the court?
I don't know how it does now. I know that Sam's an unbelievable basketball player. If you look at Sam Bowie's stats, and this is the great thing about the story, the thesis really is that he's not a bust. I mean, he averages like 17 points a game. If If you have a big man that averages 17 points a game, like look at his career stats. Sam Bowie was great. Why is he a bust? Well, he's just a bust because the greatest player in the history of the world was drafted in front of him. But if you look at what they needed at the time, they didn't need another guard.
Yeah.
They had Clyde Drexler. So they needed a big. And so they took a big. A big, by the way, who was doing things, you know, now, you know, the Dirk Nowitzki, you've got 7-footers shooting from the outside. I mean, look at Michigan basketball.
Yeah.
Michigan basketball is all about 7-footers shooting from the outside. At the time, what he was doing was groundbreaking. So it's really, history is the lens that you put on it. And that you can see, but you have to understand your history and really do the research and say, you know what, maybe that's become a catchphrase, but you got to look at it and say, no, he wasn't a bust. And that was kind of the thesis statement, and it's understanding, and that goes back to the reporting and knowing your history and researching and looking at it and going, this actually doesn't bear truth to the common phrase. And you have to look at it and say, well, who's he being compared against? Well, he's being compared against the greatest basketball player ever. So that's the cool thing about storytelling in my stories. You can look at it and say, okay, what's the real story here?
Yeah, and I think history, because that's kind of a theme of this conversation now, but I think a lot of your work has, especially if we take a look at, let's say, Pin Kings and the return and going big, has to do with history, because, you know, Pin Kings set against 1990s Miami, the return to do with the Vietnam War, as we've said, and going big set in the 70s and 80s. How do you find sports is kind of weaved into this fabric of society, history, and politics?
I have a coworker of mine, a reporter friend of mine. He says, John, you love context. You love to put... And I said, yeah, you have to understand the times to understand the story. Because you can't understand... Like, you have to understand, like in Pin Kings, for example, that this is just what was going on in Miami. You had this sleepy town that suddenly was overrun with drugs, with cocaine. And you have to understand, okay, this is why the people in this documentary, these choices were in front of them and how they ended up choosing those choices. If you don't understand the context of it, then you're not going to understand, like 80s Miami was fast. There was drugs that were coming into the country. A lot of the point of entrance was Miami. You were growing a town. And so the Miami of then is not the same as the Miami of now. People think Miami now, and they can't conceptualize what it was then. Now, for me, that Miami story was personal because my dad grew up in Miami. And so I knew that sleepy Miami because I grew up with it. My grandfather used to send me, like, this is so dated, newspaper clippings of the Miami Herald about the Miami Dolphins and the Miami Hurricanes. So I grew up learning and living and knowing Miami was part of me. As much as Boston was part of me, Miami was part of me. My mom's from Boston, my dad's from Miami. Understanding and context. And that's when you do a story. I think the best stories, not even just my work, but beyond my work, is you have to give a sense of place, you have to give a sense of understanding, of time, and then you understand and you can sympathize or relate to or understand, even if you don't sympathize, because I'm just laying out the facts, but you can have a deeper sense of why the character is, you know. You can understand, for example, when I say sympathize, Rocky Bleier, he slipped through the cracks, and then he got his draft notice. And then, 6 months in, they say he's never going to play football again. This guy was captain in Notre Dame. You have to understand, like, everybody got draft notices. His number just came up. So it's just kind of, when you do especially longer form storytelling, but even in shorter form storytelling, I want the viewer to understand the motivation. Even the silly stuff, too, like we did a silly, I did a talk earlier today, and I was talking about, do you know who Uncle Rico is?
Yes.
Napoleon Dynamite. So they came to me and they said, well, Gardner Minshew, who was the quarterback for the Jacksonville Jaguars, they're calling him the modern day Uncle Rico. And so they're like, do you think you can get Uncle Rico? And I'm like, well, yeah, let's try to get Uncle Rico, and then we'll get the van too, and we'll just have some fun with it. Like, you got to know when to have fun. You got to
Yeah.
know when to be serious. You got to know when to be heartfelt. But it's an understanding of the story, and Gardner went along with it. So every story brings its own unique challenges. But I think taking a moment before you do a story, and stepping back and say, okay, what is this story about? How are we going to tell it? Just take a moment and then realize, okay, this may be a one way to tell a story. There's 1,000 ways to tell a story, but an understanding of the story before you start the story, I always feel is the best way.
And just in terms of storytelling, since you've done Pin Kings in a number of formats, a number of mediums, you've done it as an article, as ESPN's first episodic podcast, and as a long-form documentary, what affordances did you find each medium, each format provided?
So it's funny. The way the podcast came about was we went into this as a TV documentary. This was a straight TV documentary. But as we did it, for those that don't know, the viewers out there, Pin Kings is a story about two best friends, co-captains of a high school wrestling team, who go separate ways during the war on drugs in the 80s. One becomes the biggest drug smuggler you've never heard of. The other becomes a DEA agent, and the natural conflict between these two friends is the engine that drives the story. Ultimately, doing a story like that gave us the scenario to say, okay, we'll go shoot this. And we went and shot this, but it's such a deep and rich story that we did all these very long interviews. And as we did the interviews, we realized we had a lot of content. So then, in order to promote the documentary, the TV documentary, because first and foremost, I'm a TV producer, we said, okay, well, let's do a podcast. So the cool thing about the podcast was we would tape it in the morning at like 5 a.m., like 5, 6 in the morning, and then I'd go into the edit room for TV from like 8 till like 6, 7 o'clock at night, and then we tape the podcast some more or write some scripts for that, and then move forward. And it was originally intended to just promote the documentary.
Yeah.
What it ended up being is this unbelievable vehicle for us to actually tell a really thorough story. And the cool thing about podcast was we weren't limited to anything. So it was the early days of episodic storytelling. There wasn't a lot of them out there. Now there are. But at the time, I think it was a handful, if that. And so what it allowed us to do was really explore the story. Because the first cut of the TV documentary was 7.5 hours long.
Okay.
And they're like, all right, we got to get this down, like way down. So as you guys who work in TV know, cutting 7.5 hours to 1 hour is a lot.
Yeah.
But the podcast gave us time. And then the cool thing about the podcast was it started airing while I was still in the edit room. So people were hearing the story, which was wild too. And then the wild thing was, normally you do a documentary and then you get the phone call from the subjects and you realize, and especially a story this tricky, whether or not you did it right? Did you do it correctly? Did you still? And that's the greatest thing. And people always say, oh, this and that. The most important thing for me is to make sure I tell a story right. So not only going into the story, but every aspect of the story. I want to feel comfortable with everything that I put on TV as best of my ability. I'll fact check. Even to the fact of like the Lee Corso documentary recently. I was texting, I don't know how this is going to sound, but I was texting Kirk Herbstreit, who's a coworker of mine, someone that I work closely with. And I was like, Kirk, I got all these photos in from the Ohio State cheerleading team. Please double check with me which one is your wife, Allison. Is that Allison? Is that Allison? Is that Allison in that picture? These are and he's like, yes, the tall one, that's Allison. Yes, that's Allison. I couldn't get that wrong. So even something as simple as that, like getting Kirk Herbstreit's wife correctly in our most recent documentary, I'm texting Kirk and saying like, yes, please double check me. Please make sure I get this right. It wasn't like, oh, well, Kirk's my coworker, he's not going to care. No, I care about everything.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure I can do it to the best of my ability.
Yeah, giving a holistic and accurate story for the audience.
100%.
So it appears we are out of time, unfortunately. But Jon, thank you so much for sitting down with me today to talk about your career and your work that has not only intrigued and excited me, but so many other people, not only sports fans. That's all we have for this WOLV-TV Spotlight. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.